From the urban scar of America's most traumatic moment in recent history to the windswept plains of Texas, the story of the United States' most symbolic relic of a bygone era is one of regeneration and rebirth over the centuries. The wooden skeleton has come to be known as the World Trade Center ship. Workers are digging in the mud that was once the Hudson River, now nearly a kilometer away from the waterfront, the site of the most outrageous act of terror in America's history. They are part of a massive urban regeneration project to bring life back to the World Trade Center plaza. A wooden skeleton appears at the bottom of the pit. The ribbing and woodwork are painstakingly excavated at record speed, as construction cannot be held up in the city that never sleeps. What they find has come to represent the miraculously preserved roots of the world's greatest trading city, New York.
Every morning we went in, we walked by the fire station where all those guys had died. We walked right by their station and then into the site. It's touching. And everybody felt that. I mean, the workmen, the archaeologists, the press who came, everybody knew they were on hallowed ground.
7 years later, the story and the ship has moved far from New York, across the country to Texas. Another scorching day starts over the wooded southern plains. Here, students of the Texas A&M University at College Station work in one of the world's foremost marine archaeology and conservation centers. This is where the single most symbolic ship artifact in the history of the United States is being cured, conserved, and prepared for exhibition. Postgraduate student Meredith Stoops is preparing one of the timbers for scanning to create a scale model of the ship.
Even as you're working and it's a very monotonous routine, you kind of understand how significant the ship can be to others and where it was found. And I don't always keep that in mind, but then it comes back to you and you realize this is an important ship. Even if it was just a Hudson sloop, it's now quite important as to where it was found.
The bedrock of the World Trade Center was this ship that was ultimately preserved by this terrible destruction that happened in 2001.
All these little boats from all along the East Coast, the Caribbean, the Gulf Coast, much later on the West Coast, they were the pickup trucks. They were the vehicles that people just used every day to put something here and take it there.
Donnie Hamilton is the director of the Conservation Research Laboratory, one of the most advanced specialized laboratories in the world, founded more than 40 years ago. Peter Fix, archaeological conservator, manages nautical artifacts that come here. The timbers are at the center to be conserved and prepared for exhibition, and it is here where their deepest secrets will be revealed.
There's less than a third of the ship left, but we have enough historic data and other period ships and some ship plans that we can probably reasonably recreate it using these particular dimensions. Our ship modeler is pretty good at taking minimal remains and coming up with a fairly realistic representation of what it originally looked like.
There are about 400 large pieces and another 200 smaller pieces that had broken off and were or just associated. We received just an entire box of their only identification is found outside. So they could be part of the hull. We'll have to see if we can locate and find a home for them in the future.
Early morning, September the 11th, 2001. Two passenger aircraft crash into the World Trade Center towers, one after the other. A massive fire erupts as the full fuel tanks of the aircraft explode. The heat reaches thousands of degrees centigrade and begins warping the steel columns that hold the buildings up, as firemen rush to the scene and evacuate all those trapped in the lower floors for the next 55 minutes. Then, one by one, floor by floor, first one, then both buildings collapse, folding in on themselves and on top of the people still trapped inside. It is the most horrific terror attack against the United States ever, and brutally ends an era of unequaled peace and prosperity in world history. For the next 9 years, the United States and New York struggle with the impact of the attack. A new tower rises from the ashes. Two great cavities with waterfalls have been created where the Twin Towers once stood, and a single new skyscraper rises in their place, the One World Trade Center. The memorial flag in the adjacent square is permanently at half-mast, but the square is one of the city's tourist attractions. Warren Rees has returned here to see what has become of one of the most significant archaeological finds in American history, one that he helped excavate. Lying under this parking garage, just south of the South Tower, is the place where archaeologists found what has become known as the World Trade Center ship, one of the nation's most extraordinary discoveries, but also one of its least celebrated.
To me, the heavy construction of it, well, so were the towers, you know, but they're gone. Nothing we built internal.
During the slow process of repurposing the whole area, the archaeologists of engineering consultant firm AKRF are contracted by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation to recover any artifacts of significance. Michael Papalardo, senior archaeologist at AKRF, coordinates the work on the ground.
Well, AKRF's initial involvement stretches back to the years after 9/11, as the City of New York planned the rebuilding process and reconstructing Lower Manhattan. One of the sites was south of the World Trade Center, that it was an area sensitive for the presence of the landfill retaining devices, the timber structures that were used as they built the city out westward into the Hudson River.
As the ancient timbers emerge from the mud, the archaeologists realize that what they have stumbled on is a mystery ship, a time capsule, inexplicably buried for centuries under the layers of New York. The find is potentially laden with significance. Mike Papalardo turns to America's leading ship archaeologist, Warren Rees.
The ship was sitting down about 20-some feet below the street level, and it was in the middle of a large area that was being excavated for the construction. So we were just south of the South Tower, what had been the South Tower of the World Trade Center. And we're looking at the bottom timbers of a ship, a small ship, and We had, it looked like about 50 feet of it at a quick glance. We had 5 minutes to look at it before we had to go to a planning meeting.
The ship, the condition of the wood was simply remarkable. The wood was buried beneath many feet of water-saturated silts and clays. And that environment is anaerobic, so there's the normal processes of breaking down organic matter weren't continuing. They had continued for some period of time before the ship was buried. So the portions of the ship that had a higher elevation than the river bottom had rotted away.
So the amazing archaeological adventure begins, with time ticking. The long working days end in the Irish pub nearby, where archaeologists marvel and reflect on the meaning of what they have found.
Day one.
Over 5 days, 2 teams work to extract the ship from the Manhattan mud. A team from New York, under the leadership of Michael Papalardo, and a team from Maine, directed by Warren Rees. After just a few days, they have an idea of what kind of ship it is and the symbolism of where it lay.
We were given a week and told us we could work as many hours as we could in 5 days, basically. And they gave us a week to get ready. So I brought in, besides the AKRF archaeology team, which was great, I brought in some ship specialists that it was students who'd work with me.
Although the work has to be done quickly, the team nevertheless takes every precaution to record the exact location of every artifact. The ship is a historical puzzle, and every clue is vital to decoding its secrets.
Because it had to happen so fast, everybody makes mistakes, but when you're moving that fast, I just figured we were going to make a lot of mistakes. So in archaeology, you have one shot. It's not like other sciences where you can redo the experiment. You take one layer, you record it, and you destroy it. So you got to do it right. And so normally we record things in about 3 different ways. We draw things, we measure things, we map things. And in addition to that, we used a laser, a 3-dimensional laser, recording every day of it at noontime. And then right after that, we had 3-dimensional spherical photography done on the site, so that whatever we missed one way, we pick up the other.
Some artifacts are the types of objects that are dumped in as disposing of garbage. There were many businesses in the area, and as the ships would bring goods off of the would bring goods into the city, they'd be brought off the ship, and some would fall into the open water. So some of the artifacts were simply lying on the river bottom. Other artifacts were perhaps associated with the ship itself. You know, they are artifacts that were being stored in the ship or used by the people that operated the ship. And then other artifacts were in the fill that was used to raise the elevation of this area as the land was filled in.
I thought we had the bow because it was very rounded and the frames were what we call canted. So I thought we had the bow. As we proceeded down, though, it became obvious from some of the construction there, meaning that there was a stern post that came up, and there are things called gudgeons, which are like part of a hinge on the back of the vessel that the pintles from the rudder stick in so the rudder can move. And we started seeing, uh-oh, we've got the stern.
As the ship emerges from the debris and mud, more of its details become apparent. An odd item of wood raises many questions.
Another odd thing about the construction was the stern. Now, the stern is made up of a number of heavy timbers normally. This one, it was one piece, one 600-pound piece of oak that had been carved, beautifully carved, to function as what we call the stern knee that would be right at the end, and what's called the deadwood underneath, all one piece. Never seen that before.
It's a fabulous piece of wood. It's, I think, 11 feet long, about 2 feet wide, and what remains going up towards the transom is probably remains about 2.5, 3 feet. It weighs 500. We weighed it out. Currently, pre-conservation, it weighs 545 pounds. So it's a hefty piece of timber. So I mean, I don't know if anyone can specifically interpret an exact reason, but it is a wonderful piece of wood.
More yet emerges. There are signs the ship sailed as far as the Caribbean.
The other thing was that it obviously had teredo shipworm all through the outer hull. Okay, that's not uncommon. What was uncommon was that it didn't have an outer sheathing to protect it, as if it wasn't made to go into warm salt water. And when we got the information back from Kevin Eckelbarger, who's with me at the University of Maine, that these were warm water species. And we, okay, so here's a vessel that's flat-bottomed, double-ended, big sloop, and it's going to the Caribbean, maybe Bermuda. It made sense.
The ship's hull is extraordinarily shallow in the water, another clue as to its category.
We got down to the keel at the very bottom of the vessel, and it was 4 to 6 inches. So here you have a sailing vessel that's 50 to 60 feet long, maybe 20 feet wide, with a keel that couldn't stop that vessel from going sideways in the wind. There are no centerboards. They didn't have centerboards yet at that point. So what was keeping this vessel from going sideways? Maybe a lee board, which would be a board on the side of the vessel that you drop down with, so and then you can pick it up. It's on a hinge. Normally you'd have 2, but some vessels had 1. But we didn't have the upper part of the vessel, so we couldn't tell if this one had lee boards or not.
Lee boards have been used for centuries in flat-bottomed boats, such as this Dutch sloop, seen in the Harlingen to Terschelling race. These boats, too, have rounded sterns. As the timbers are removed and mapped, certain construction characteristics begin to surprise the archaeologists, ones that will later be a source of concern for the conservators.
In the 18th century, almost every vessel, those planks and the outer planks are attached to the rest of the ship with wooden pegs called trunnels. It comes from the word tree nail. And this had 2 or 3 trunnels in the whole vessel. Everything was put together with iron nails. Very, very uncommon. In fact, quite rare. I'd never seen one in person because that was a very expensive way to make a vessel. And those ships had to go through storms. Well, if you have oak and pine and iron and it starts working, the iron's going to start cutting the wood around it.
Most of the ship was iron fastened. I believe I'd have to go look at the records, but I think there are 3 or 4 trunnels that were actually found. But the overwhelming majority of materials were iron. And that's very quick. And it looks, you can interpret some of the labor issues that are going on, the sociological issues that are going on. In fact, if they were doing that, then the product is becoming a lot cheaper than the labor itself.
Once the ship is entirely excavated, nearly 800 artifacts have been collected. Every detail of how they lay in their original position and their spatial relationship with the other pieces around them recorded. The archaeologists and scientists now begin working on the DNA of the ship. Dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, provides a vital clue. Amazingly, this science of dating the timbers shows that the World Trade Center ship was built from the same white oak woodland that was felled to build Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where the United States Declaration of Independence and Constitution was signed.
The FBI and Interpol have software that looks at fingerprints. So if you have someone you think might have done something, you take their fingerprints, and this software goes to everybody's data bank that signed in and compares it. So why don't we do that with dendrochronology, where everybody around the world who signs in makes their data available? We use that same software to do the comparison. And so when they looked at the samples from our vessel, they just put it out, and the software looked and found, oh, someone did that oak tree near Philadelphia, and it's a perfect match for your vessel. It was wonderful.
There were 3 layers of the ship: the inner series of planks, and then the outer layer of planks, and then a series of large structural timbers in between. And they created these small areas where sediments accumulated, and the artifacts in between those, they're called futtocks, between the futtocks were somewhat of a good context archaeologically. It's unlikely that they ended up there from the fill that happened afterwards.
The initial interest in the amazing find wanes as New Yorkers continue to live their busy lives in the financial and trading capital of the world. Little do they know, still today, that deep beneath their vertical city, in the bounds below the subway level, lie other ships. New York has been a trading city since the time of its founding by the Dutch as New Amsterdam in 1625.
I think the English would have probably called a hoy a work vessel. It's a small work vessel from 40 to 60 feet long is a hoy, and it can be a number of shapes. The Dutch would have called something like this, excuse my Dutch, but something like wildschip, which would be a double-ender sloop about that size, but that was an earlier kind of vessel. I think it's great in a way, because we don't know exactly what where it was from, what it was doing.
Back in the day, 100, 150, 200 years ago, everybody had a boat, just about, especially everybody in a seaport town, which is centripetal, not centrifugal. That's why you become so concentrated, because there's no room. Everybody wants to be by the ocean. You grow up on top of yourself. You grow up right by the water. And this ship, the World Trade Center ship, is indicative of that life.
New York was the trading pivot point for the whole of the Hudson River basin. Philadelphia craftsmen built this working boat that sailed down the whole American coast and traded as far inland as Albany. It was based in New York, a city located to take advantage of both access to the sea and major waterways.
So the city was extended outwards hundreds and hundreds of feet over time. It started off on the east side of Manhattan, and they would have to fill in, either fill in land or extend the docks further out into the deeper water. And that was the way the city was able to grow, was through establishing bulkheads and piers, and then enclosing them and filling that area in.
Especially right around the Federalist period in the United States, you have an initial boom almost. It is just before the Industrial Revolution, but you can look and trace with some research how things are progressing, and there's an awful large need to move product, to move commerce, and the rise of New York. New York was the pinnacle. I mean, it was the epicenter.
Urban regeneration is an ongoing process here. Buildings are put up and ripped down and rebuilt higher still, a process propelled by access to the Hudson River. The Hudson is a shallow, tidal river, treacherous for the inexperienced sailor. Here at Kingston, a group of volunteers are working on the upkeep of a replica of a Hudson River sloop, although of a later epoch.
So this is a sloop. Sloop is a single-masted sailing vessel. This sloop is a replication of sloops that would have sailed on the Hudson in the 18th and 19th century, carrying cargo from New York City to Albany and back up and down the river. So they are a peculiar design. Designed for sailing in the Hudson. Very large mainsail, tall mast to catch as much or as little rather wind there is in the river in the summer months. A wide boat, very stable with a shallow draft because the Hudson is muddy and fairly shallow in a lot of places.
The Hudson River sloop Clearwater is the brainchild of songwriter and activist Pete Seeger, as a way of bringing attention to the devastation of the Hudson River by heavy industry in the post-war era.
From New York City and further south, the sloops would have been carrying finished goods mostly up the river to the farms and communities upriver, and then on the way back down they would have been carrying kind of bulk goods, timber or large quantities of whatever to head to the factories in New York City and stuff. That was the general trend of the pattern of movement of goods up and down the river.
The Hudson River sloops played a key role in building New York. Here in one of New Amsterdam's first roads, Bowery Street, stands Manhattan's oldest bank, founded in 1834. And close by is Chinatown, where brick buildings have stood for hundreds of years. They have become one of the characteristics of central New York and represent building techniques that relied on the import of this light, dependable material. And that had to be transported to Manhattan, down the Hudson River.
The sloops would carry tons and tons of brick up and down the river. I often will tell students, like, next time you're in New York City, take a look around. Like, how much brick do you see? You're going to see a lot of brick. And a lot of that brick came from the Hudson Valley and was shipped to New York on sloops.
New York City is constantly rebuilt, over and over again, each skyscraper standing on the rubble of the previous one. A winter sun sets over New York, where the eternal play of glass and steel reflects in the sea and creates a fairy tale skyline of offices where trade never stops. The World Trade Center ship has left New York for conservation in the nation's foremost marine archaeology laboratory. Here in College Station, Texas, Donnie Hamilton and his team have been able to get an intimate picture of the ship found under Ground Zero. Apart from the excitement of having the World Trade Center ship in their hands, the conservators in Texas have the great responsibility of preserving this highly symbolic artifact. They first have to deal with the serious problems that all the nails in the ship pose.
And so we are just now getting to the process. We've gone through all the rinsing. Obviously, in 5 years, all the soluble salts have been rinsed out pretty much. And so now we've been dealing primarily with removing the iron, and that's pretty much has been done now. And then also we've been scanning all the material with the Faro arm, the 3D scanner, so that we can make a complete digital model of the ship.
For about a year, all the timbers will go into a solution of ammonium citrate, which is a chelation, or it'll actually go in and pull out the iron
iron doesn't want to be iron, and so it corrodes. And with salt water, we have a further complication is that it's now the corrosion products are mixed with the sodium chloride from the salt water. And so when you have sodium chloride, you have ferrous chloride and ferric chloride. Once you expose it to the air and the atmospheric moisture, it converts to hydrochloric acid.
We will start to slowly impregnate polyethylene glycol into the timbers themselves. And once that reaches a certain percentage, we'll then put everything in the freeze dryer for 4 to 6 months, depending on its thickness. And when it comes out, it'll be cleaned and ready to start being reconstructed into the ship itself.
These are all the different vats that have the WTC material in it. They used to be over here being pre-processed, but now they've been measured and scanned, and so we're getting ready to start into the next stage. So we're sequestering all of the iron out of it now, and then they'll be taken after they go through the next treatment and put into the freeze dryer. This is the largest archaeological freeze dryer in the Americas by far. It's 8-foot diameter, 40-foot long, and all computer controlled, and essentially it's used for once we get all the iron out of the wood, and then essentially have it pre-treated polyethylene glycol, then it's put into the freeze dryer. Once the water is frozen and you put it in the freeze dryer, then it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state without going through an intervening liquid state. And it's the liquid state that as it dries, the surface tension of the water pulls all the cell walls together. That's what causes the wood to shrink and collapse, is the surface tension of the water evaporating, pulling the cell walls in. So by going directly to a gas state, we eliminate that problem.
The unit is famed for the 17-year-long conservation of La Belle, a French exploration ship discovered in Matagorda Bay.
When we started the Bell project back in 1995, we thought it was going to be a 5-year project. Well, it turned out to be an 18-year project, and at a cost of over $5 million. And so even these, the WTC and the Alexandria, you're talking about more than $500,000 just to do the conservation on these. So the problem is, the cost of doing it, but that's why this lab is a valuable contribution in that we're able to do things here much cheaper than if someone tried to do it on their own and tried to recreate the facilities that we have here.
Meredith Stoops is a volunteer from the Archaeology postgrad course and has spent months scanning timbers from the World Trade Center ship.
We have to go out to the vats outside and collect individual timbers that we'll bring in to scan. They've been sitting in there for quite a while, so they need cleaned off. The ferro arm it collects very minute information, so anything growing on the timber will be picked up easily, so you have to remove anything like that. So after we've cleaned it off, we bring it in, and you'll place one timber down in front of the scanner. Scan one side, flip it over, and do the next.
Dr. Christopher Dostal has just finished his doctoral thesis on making a scale 3D model of the World Trade Center ship. Using advanced technology, he and volunteers scan the timbers one by one, keeping them wet constantly.
When you're moving this, it has sensors in each of the articulated joints, and if you put too much pressure on one of the sensors, a warning will come up, it'll stop collecting data. And so we were working out in the bay here, and we started to get a lot of error messages from the base of the previous arm that we had. And so we'd had the arm for 9 years, so at this point it was well out of warranty. I'm by no means an engineer, but I thought, well, maybe it's just a loose wire, or maybe it's if I take it apart, it's something I'll be able to see if there's a problem. So I brought the arm next door and laid it out on the table, and once I got the final screw out and I pulled the cover off, just a pile of ants fell out.
Scanning the timbers has given the conservators an incredibly accurate picture of how the ship was built.
I'm recreating the ship exactly as it was in the ground. So whatever distortions there might have been, or, if the wood has changed shape over time, or if pieces are broken and fallen into place, that's all going to be perfectly represented in my model. So I'm doing a very good job of recreating what the ship looked like when it was dug up. What Glenn will be doing is taking the shape of the ship is determined by something we call ship lines. So when you're a shipwright, if you're designing a ship, you loft the shape of the ship with a series of lines that project the space through the different dimensions. And so I'm able to use this model here to extract the original lines from the ship and then take those, and now we can extrapolate those to get the rest of the ship.
On the campus itself, the team possesses a little celebrated secret asset. It comes in the form of Glenn Grieco, an expert in wooden ships and, especially, building scale models of them. This is the third model of La Belle that he has built.
We start with the remains, and we try to find similar vessels, similar contemporary vessels, and it's just a lot of research, trying to find drafts if they exist, historic documents that mention the construction, or even information about what materials the vessel was going to be carrying. The hull would have to be designed a certain way to carry certain materials. It really differs per vessel, though.
There's two halves to this, right? So whatever's on the table you can't scan. So you scan the top part and as much of the sides as you can, and then you save that, and then you'll scan the next side as much of the sides as you can. And then once you do that, you can go through and find the same point on both scans and tell the computer, hey, like this little divot here is the same on this scan as it is on this scan, and it'll try and align those two. So if you just keep telling it points over and over again, after about 4 or 5, it does a pretty good alignment. And then what the software will do is it actually track the overlap. It'll sample a certain % of the scan and then refine that alignment.
Scanning the timbers has been complex, and getting the scans of each side to match time-consuming. The match has to be perfect, so that the 3D printer can extrude plastic scale replicas of each timber to build a perfect model, giving Peter Fix and his team something to practice rebuilding the ship with. To make the model accurate, Glenn uses not only all the documentation he can get hold of, but also his own experience in ship lines.
There are 3 or 4 other Dutch vessels that have about the same shape. I looked at all of those to see if there were some features in those that we could use for this. Dutch cargo vessels tend to have very, very full hulls. And in the 1830s and 1840s, when you see what the Hudson River sloops evolved into, they're much finer, much sleeker. So we know this is somewhere in the transition. And looking at the lines that Chris Dostal pulled off of the actual remains, you can see it's a much fuller vessel. And so it still has some of those characteristics of the earlier Dutch vessels.
But so the first thing was to put in the spine and to take those 3 pieces and fix them together. And then the next was to add the keel, the stern knee back here, which is this big piece here. Right? This would have been the main structural support for the end. And then attached to the stern knee is the stern post. That's a separate piece here. And if I get close, you see that when I scanned the stern knee, it actually still had a bolt in it in the print as well. The main bolt that fixed the two printed perfectly fine. It was scanned perfectly fine. And the hole that it was in scanned fine. So I was able to just use the original fastener to line up the two.
From the skeleton of the ship, he is able to build a 3D photocopy scale model of the World Trade Center ship, which will allow Glenn Grieco to estimate the ship lines.
First of all, we need to come up with a set of lines for a vessel that approximates the shape. And of course, using all the details that we know from other types of vessels and other vessels from the same period, we'll try to incorporate all those details in and come up with a believable hull that accurately reproduces what the original would have looked like.
So this is basically just melted plastic. And what you do is you put the model in, and then the slicing software analyzes the model and then calculates, it just slices it into a lot of thin layers and calculates the path that a 3D printer head would have to take. Each one of these meshes is added to the slicer software, and then the software goes through and maps the route that that piping bag will have to take to build up to this level.
I think what really helps the most is the work that Peter Fix and Chris Dostal did with not only scanning in all the timbers and coming up with a good set of lines, but also the reconstruction, just reassembling them. That always helps.
It very likely was a very broad, flat-shaped bottom with a fairly hard chine. The bilge here, you can see it's a very hard turn. So it would have just been a shallow, drafted, beamy bus of a boat that could take a lot of people and goods up and down the Hudson River. It almost certainly had a single mast, although we don't have the mast step, but just based on the shape, you couldn't have put more. So there's been a lot of studies of what the ship shape of the Hudson River sloop might be. Regardless of whether or not this matches the previous studies, it was almost certainly a slooped rig boat on the Hudson River.
For many more months, it will be quietly cured and consolidated in the warm rural plains of Texas, where time stands still, before moving back to where it plied its trade, to bear witness to the very origins of New York State, in the freezing northern tip of the United States. On the other side of the United States, far to the north of Manhattan, lies the city of Albany, the capital of New York State. This is where the New York State Museum is housed. Michael Lucas is the curator of historical archaeology.
Well, the first thing is, of course, it's quite rare, and they found the ship, and ships are very interesting for the public, of course, because they're this sort of this little time capsule, a moment sort of in time. And so for me, it was interesting that this particular ship would tie into this larger story of not just New York's role in New York City's role in the development of New York State, but also in the development of the United States during the late 18th and early 19th century. So it's really an interesting way, and the ship sort of becomes a protagonist in this story.
The Dutch didn't have much, you know, in terms of natural resources. They made most of their money by trading with other people and carrying goods on their ships. So they came over here and they looked at Manhattan Island and they said, well, if we have a little settlement at the southern tip of this island, we can control all the trade for this huge hinterland.
Here at the State Museum, we have over 2 million artifacts from Lower Manhattan alone that trace the early European settlements of what was initially New Amsterdam right through the 20th century. So the ship will be a major part of filling a gap in this collection we have to tell the story of how the city grew and how the state grew.
The longtime director of the museum is Mark Sharming, and he has been managing the 9/11 exhibit for a decade. For all New Yorkers, the World Trade Center ship has a special significance.
And so, of course, it's just symbolic that this great tower, this piece of world history, stood over this ship and was never found. I don't know that they knew it was there when they built the towers. They went down to bedrock, but somehow preserved it as well. And then not to be discovered until the towers collapsed and came down. So that story is pretty amazing as well. We would never know about this except for the terrible destruction of the World Trade Center.
New York State was once the gateway to the west and to the north, and the Hudson River was the thoroughfare to the great expanses of North America. The archaeological context of the World Trade Center ship gives us clues to the historical period that it was active in. One of the most startling discoveries was a button of the 52nd Regiment of Foot, a British infantry unit active in the Revolutionary Wars.
In the case of if this was a ship that was pressed into service during the Revolutionary War, it would have been a troop transport. There was a button that was found that's from the 52nd Regiment afoot. So it was a Revolutionary War uniform button. Now, does that mean there were soldiers on there from the 52nd? Maybe.
And and what's New York today? It's the trading capital of America, if not part of the world. And where was this vessel? In the World Trading Center, World Trade Center. So it all fits to the history. It has huge significance to Manhattan and America that it was there. Now, it wasn't meant to be, under the World Trade Center, but there it was. So, looking back from the World Trade Center that's been rebuilt now, here's a piece of that history that developed this island.
The mystery ship was built in Philadelphia and sank in New York around the time of the nation's independence. It offers a mere glimpse of what life was like when the city and the nation were young. As millions of the world's downtrodden came to the windswept Hudson to make new lives, the sloop was buried in the foundations of the World Trade Center. 200 years later, the Twin Towers were attacked and destroyed, taking nearly 3,000 lives with them.
I live in a small rural area of Maine, and so everybody has 5 hats, and one of my hats was I was a volunteer fireman, and 33 years. I was a captain at the time the World Trade Center got hit, and was an EMT for 20 years. And so, we saw those guys going in, they didn't come out. 4 of those guys had been our instructors. So I knew 2 of them a little bit. But it wasn't just that, it was this whole concept of these people going, that's what we do, So I had that personal connection too. So when we went to the site, it wasn't just as an American, but it was also the firefighter, EMT, and me, and the archaeologist all coming together. So I'm not an emotional person, but it is pretty emotional for me.
For 250 years, New York City has grown on the remains of humble ships like this one, built with the same wood as Independence Hall. Today, above the very spot where it was found, the glistening One World Trade Center rises into the sky, a towering symbol of the United States of America's resolve to rebuild and remain the global center of commerce.